Close your eyes, wherever you are right now. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever surface supports you. Notice the gentle rise and fall of your breath. There is nowhere you need to be but here. There is nothing you need to do but listen. In a moment, we will travel backward through time. We will journey to a place of extraordinary mountains and endless plateaus. We will walk through palaces of stone that still stand in ruins after more than 2,000 years. We will meet emperors and soldiers, priests and merchants, farmers and queens. We will witness the rise of one of history's greatest empires, and we will see in time how even the mightiest of human creations must eventually give way to change. But before we go there, let yourself settle more deeply into this present moment. Feel your shoulders releasing their tension. Feel the back of your head against the pillow or surface beneath you. There is a deep safety in historical knowledge. The past has already happened. We cannot be harmed by it. We are simply observers, witnesses to the grand unfolding of human story. The Persian Empire stretched from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east. It encompassed deserts and mountains, cities and villages, peoples of dozens of languages and faiths. For more than 200 years, it was the largest, most organized, most sophisticated empire the world had yet known. As you rest here, suspended between waking and sleep, we will discover how one man, a boy, really, when he began, built something that would reshape civilization itself. And we will learn what that greatness meant for the people who lived beneath its rule. The journey begins. Let yourself drift into the history ahead. To understand the Persian Empire, we must first journey backward, beyond its splendor, to a time when the people we would come to call Persians were not unified at all, but scattered, fragmented, moving across the high plateaus of what we now call Iran. The time is somewhere around 700 BCE. The place is a harsh landscape of mountains and steppes. There are no great cities yet. There are no stone palaces or treasuries overflowing with gold. Instead, there are tribes, dozens of them, each with its own leaders, its own laws, its own gods. Imagine standing on a high plateau, the wind dry and persistent around you. The air is thin here. The land rises to 8,000 feet and beyond. You can see for impossible distances. In the distance, ranges of mountains stretch toward the horizon, their peaks white with snow even in summer. This is the ancestral home of the Persian people. The tribes who would create the Persian Empire were Indo-European peoples. They had migrated to this high plateau centuries before, moving from grasslands to the north and west, seeking better pasture for their flocks of sheep and horses. They were not a settled people. They were herders, warriors, horsemen. The horse was central to their identity. A Persian man without a horse was almost unimaginable. Mastery of the horse was the skill that separated the weak from the strong. These tribes had names that have echoed through history. The Medes, to the north, were among the strongest and most organized. The Persians proper, the Parsua, were initially less powerful. The Elamites, to the south, had their own kingdom with ancient roots. The Lydians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all these peoples shared the region, and all of them competed for resources and power. Life in these pre-empire centuries was difficult and uncertain. A drought could devastate your herds. A raid from a neighboring tribe could destroy your wealth in a single night. The larger powers, the mighty Assyrian Empire to the west, the organized kingdoms to the south, these forces shaped the world around you. And there was little a small tribal leader could do to resist them. It is around 700 BCE when we first have written records mentioning the Persians by name. They are described by Assyrian scribes as a people dwelling on the eastern edge of the civilized world. Not particularly remarkable, not particularly threatening, just another tribal people, struggling to survive on a difficult land. But something was beginning to change. The world's great empires were shifting. The Assyrian dominance was starting to crack. In the chaos of changing powers, there was an opportunity. And in the tribal lands of Persia, there was a family that would seize that opportunity and transform it into something unprecedented. The family belonged to a clan called the Achaemenids. This name is almost forgotten now, but for the next 3.5 centuries, it would be synonymous with the greatest power on earth. The Achaemenids would produce the kings who unified the scattered tribes. The Achaemenids would build the palaces. The Achaemenids would create an administrative system so efficient it would become a model for empires to come. But in 700 BCE, they were just one family among many. Their herds grazed on land that was not clearly theirs. Their warriors were respected in the region but not feared across the world. They paid tribute to more powerful neighbors. They had ambition, perhaps, but no way yet to achieve it. And then a boy was born. We know this from the Greeks, from Herodotus, the ancient historian who would later record Persian history for a Greek audience. The Greeks called him Cyrus. To the Persians, he was known as Korosh or Kurosh. In the historical record, he is Cyrus the Great, and there has never been a person with a better claim to that title. The stories that grew up around his birth are legendary, almost mythical. Herodotus tells us that a king, possibly his grandfather, had a dream that a child born to his bloodline would grow up to overthrow him. In fear, the king ordered the newborn Cyrus killed. But servants took pity on the child. They spirited him away to be raised by a shepherd family. This is the kind of story that grows up around great men. Whether it is literally true, whether there actually was such an order, such a rescue, we cannot know with certainty. History and legend are woven together in the ancient sources. But what we can say is this: by adulthood, Cyrus had distinguished himself as a warrior and a leader. He had proven his worth in ways that could not be ignored. The Median kingdom to the north had grown very powerful under a king called Astyages. The Persians remained subject to Median rule. But in the middle of the 6th century BCE, probably around 553 BCE, though the exact date is uncertain, Cyrus led a rebellion against this overlord. It was not a quick victory. It was not, perhaps, as dramatic as the legends make it sound. But gradually, through military prowess and strategic thinking, Cyrus defeated the Median forces. And what happened next was extraordinary. Rather than destroying the Median kingdom, rather than enslaving the Median people, Cyrus incorporated them. The Median aristocracy was brought into the Persian administration. Median culture was honored. Median soldiers were recruited into Persian armies. This would become Cyrus's great gift as a ruler. He understood that you could not rule a vast empire through conquest alone. You had to offer people a reason to accept your rule willingly. You had to make them feel that they were part of something greater. With the Medes united with the Persians, Cyrus was no longer just a tribal leader. He was the ruler of a significant regional power. He was a man to be reckoned with. And now, with the Median kingdom secured, he could look outward. The great powers of the world were arrayed around him, and he set his gaze upon them. To understand what Cyrus accomplished in the following decades, we must understand the world as it existed in the mid-6th century BCE. This is a world where empires are measured not in hundreds, but in thousands of miles. This is a world where the greatest powers command armies that can number in the hundreds of thousands. And this is a world where conquest is not unusual. It is the expected behavior of any ruler with the power to conquer. At this time, the dominant power in the Near East was the Lydian kingdom, located in what is now Turkey. Its king, Croesus, was legendary for his wealth. Even today, we say someone is as rich as Croesus when we speak of great riches. He controlled the trade routes between Asia and the Mediterranean. He minted the first standardized coins. His treasury was almost inconceivably full of gold. To the south and west, the Neo-Babylonian Empire controlled the great cities and trade centers of Mesopotamia. Babylon itself was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its walls rose higher than mountains. Its hanging gardens were said to be so beautiful they made grown men weep. Its king, Nabonidus, ruled over millions of subjects and commanded vast resources. And scattered among these great powers were smaller kingdoms, city-states, and peoples, all seeking to maintain their independence or advance their interests in the complex dance of ancient power politics. Cyrus understood something that many conquerors have failed to grasp. He understood that the appearance of legitimacy was nearly as important as force itself. When he moved against the Lydian kingdom around 547 BCE, he did not simply attack. He publicized claims that Croesus, the Lydian king, had attacked him first. Whether this was true or whether it was propaganda, which is to say, whether the source of conflict matters at all to history, Cyrus was able to present himself as acting in justified self-defense. The armies met somewhere in what is now central Turkey. The historical record is unclear about the exact details of the battles that followed, but the outcome was decisive. Cyrus defeated Croesus, captured the city of Sardis, the Lydian capital, and absorbed the Lydian kingdom into his growing Persian Empire. The kingdom of legendary wealth became a Persian province. But again, Cyrus did not attempt to destroy what he had conquered. He did not massacre the population. He did not forbid their religion or suppress their culture. Instead, he organized them. He drew them into his administrative system. The Lydian nobles found places in his court. Lydian soldiers, with their skills and their military traditions, were integrated into his armies. This is what set Cyrus apart from other great conquerors. He was not driven by a desire for destruction. He was driven by a vision of unity. He wanted to create something larger than himself, something that could endure, something that could encompass diverse peoples under a single rule. With the Lydian kingdom secured, Cyrus had control of much of the Western world. His gaze now turned eastward and southward. There were cities and kingdoms and peoples in every direction, and with each year that passed, the territory of his empire grew. Around 540 BCE, Cyrus turned his attention to Babylon. The great city on the Euphrates River represented the heart of Mesopotamian power. Its king, Nabonidus, was aging and increasingly unpopular. The Babylonian priesthood, which held enormous power in that ancient kingdom, had grown frustrated with him. He had neglected the traditional religious ceremonies. He had spent years away from the city. There was deep discontent within Babylon itself. When Cyrus's armies approached, he again presented himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He made it known that he intended to restore the proper worship of the Babylonian gods, that he would respect the rights of the priesthood, that the people of Babylon would be better served under his rule than they were under Nabonidus. It worked. As Cyrus's armies drew near the walls of Babylon, the city itself seemed to open its gates to him. Some accounts suggest there was almost no battle at all. The troops, the priests, even many of the nobles were ready to accept the change. Nabonidus himself fled before the arrival of Persian forces. And so Babylon, the mightiest of Mesopotamian cities, the repository of ancient wisdom and wealth, the cultural center of the civilized world, became a Persian city, not conquered in blood and destruction, but received almost as a gift. Now Cyrus was undisputed master of nearly the entire known world. From the Mediterranean in the west to the edges of the Indian subcontinent in the east, wherever you went, you came under Persian rule. The small tribal confederation that had existed 2 generations before had transformed into a world empire. But Cyrus's great insight was this: an empire built on conquest and fear cannot last. An empire built on the willingness of diverse peoples to live together, to see themselves as part of something larger than themselves, that is an empire that might endure. To this end, Cyrus began what would become the great architectural projects of his reign. He chose a location in central Persia, in a valley known as the Pasargadae, and there he began to build a capital. It would not be as grand or as massive as Babylon. Later Persian rulers would build greater cities. But Pasargadae held a special significance. It was built in the ancestral homeland of the Persian people. It was a way of saying, we are still Persian, even though we now rule the world. The palace at Pasargadae was elegant and functional. It reflected Persian tastes: wide open spaces, gardens with water channels, the influence of the dry plateaus from which the Persians had come. It was a symbol of Cyrus's vision, a ruler who could unite the world while remaining true to his people's character. In the year 530 BCE, Cyrus died. The exact circumstances are unclear. The Greek sources suggest that he died in battle against the Massagetae, a nomadic people to the north and east. Perhaps he was killed by their queen, Tomiris, in a dramatic confrontation. Or perhaps the stories grew in the telling. What we know is that he died at a great age, probably in his 60s or 70s, which was ancient for the time, and that he left behind an empire of unprecedented scope and stability. The impact of Cyrus the Great cannot be overstated. In perhaps 30 years, he had transformed a peripheral tribal confederation into the master of the civilized world. He had done it through military genius, but also through political wisdom. He had shown that an empire could be built on something other than fear and oppression. It could be built on the possibility of justice, on the honor of diverse peoples, on the vision of something greater than any individual people or tribe. The Greek historian Xenophon, writing centuries later, would paint Cyrus as the ideal ruler. Not perfect, but virtuous, capable of inspiring loyalty through his character rather than through his threats. This image of Cyrus would echo through history. When later philosophers imagined what a perfect kingdom might look like, they often looked back to the memory of Cyrus the Great. But the empire he built would not remain unchanged. His son would rule after him, and his grandson. And then, more than 20 years after Cyrus's death, the throne would pass to a man who would take the Persian Empire to its greatest heights of power and organization. His name was Darius, and his reign would be the defining moment in Persian history. When Cyrus died, his son Cambyses inherited the throne. Cambyses was a capable ruler, and under his leadership, the empire continued to expand. He conquered Egypt, the last great independent kingdom that had not yet fallen to Persian control. But Cambyses was not beloved as his father had been. The ancient sources describe him as harsh, impulsive, possibly unstable. When he died, some say by his own hand, others by accident, there was no clear successor. The empire seemed on the verge of chaos. Into this vacuum stepped a man named Darius. The historical record is complex about how Darius came to power. He may have been a distant relative of Cyrus. He may have been a general. Some accounts suggest he seized power through cunning and military force. What we know is that around 522 BCE, Darius became the third great king of Persia. And unlike Cyrus, unlike Cambyses, Darius was a man obsessed with organization, with order, with making permanent the achievements his predecessors had begun. Imagine Darius as a figure of immense authority. The ancient coins and carved reliefs that survive from his time show a man with a long beard, dressed in formal robes, often holding a staff of office. He wears a tall crown. Around him are attendants and guards. He is a figure of absolute power, but also of dignity. This is a man who understood that a king's appearance, his bearing, his presentation to the world, these things matter. They communicate authority without words. When Darius took the throne, the empire was in fact more troubled than it appeared from the outside. There were rebellions in Egypt. There was discontent in Babylon. There were nomadic peoples on the northern and eastern borders who seemed always ready to attack. The vast territorial holdings that Cyrus had conquered were not securely bound together. They were a collection of provinces, some willing, some resentful, held together primarily by military force. Darius's great achievement was not conquest, though he did expand the empire further, particularly into the Indus Valley and into Eastern Europe. His great achievement was organization. He took the unwieldy, sprawling collection of territories and peoples that had been conquered by his predecessors, and he transformed it into a unified, functioning administrative system. To do this, Darius made a series of brilliant decisions. First, he divided the empire into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor, called a satrap, who answered directly to the king. The satrap was an absolute authority in his region. He collected taxes, administered justice, commanded local military forces. But he was also watched. Darius created a system of inspectors, often called the king's eyes and ears, who traveled through the empire checking on the satraps, reporting back to the king any signs of disloyalty or inefficiency. This system had a beautiful elegance to it. It allowed for decentralized rule. Each region was governed by someone who understood local conditions and customs. But it also ensured loyalty to the center. No satrap could become too powerful because he was always being watched. No satrap could neglect his duties because failure would be reported. Second, Darius standardized the currency. Before his reign, different regions used different systems of money. Trade was complicated. Taxation was inconsistent. Darius introduced a unified Persian coin called the daric, made of gold. Everywhere in the empire, from the Mediterranean to the Indus, the same coin had the same value. This made commerce easier. It made taxation more efficient. It bound the empire together economically. Third, Darius invested heavily in infrastructure. He understood that an empire cannot hold together if it cannot communicate with itself. So he built roads. The most famous was the Royal Road, stretching from the coast of the Mediterranean eastward through the entire empire to the city of Susa, over 1,500 miles. This road had stations at regular intervals where travelers and messengers could change horses, rest, and continue their journey. Along these roads, Darius also established a postal system. A traveler or messenger could move from station to station, receiving fresh horses, food, and shelter. The system was so efficient that the Greek historian Herodotus, describing it with wonder, wrote that nothing could stop these messengers from completing their journeys. Not snow, not rain, not darkness, not the heat of day. 25 centuries later, the United States Postal Service would adopt almost these same words as their motto. Fourth, Darius promoted the use of a standardized language for official business. Aramaic, the language spoken by many peoples in the western parts of the empire, became the official tongue of administration. This made governance easier. A message from the king could be understood in every province, regardless of the local language spoken by the common people. But Darius was not only an administrator. He was also a builder and a visionary. He looked at what Cyrus had begun at Pasargadae, and he decided to create something more grand. He chose a new location in Susiana, in the southwestern part of his empire, and there he began to construct a new capital city. This city would be called Susa, and it would become one of the great wonders of the ancient world. The construction took many years. Thousands of workers toiled to cut stone and transport it over vast distances. The palace that Darius built in Susa was not merely functional, it was a statement of power and artistic vision. But even Susa was not grand enough. Darius wanted a city that would represent the majesty of Persian rule in its fullest glory. And so, about 40 miles north of Susa, in the mountains of the Zagros Range, in a place called the Plain of the Marches, Darius began another construction project. This was Persepolis. Persepolis would be not merely a city, but a ceremonial capital, a place where the king would hold his most important audiences, where he would celebrate the great festivals, where visiting dignitaries and tribute-bearers from across the empire would come to acknowledge Persian dominance. It was less a place to live than a stage upon which to perform kingship. The construction of Persepolis began around 515 BCE and continued for many decades. Indeed, it was never quite finished before the empire fell. The palace complexes that Darius and his successors built there represent one of the highest achievements of ancient architecture. The columns rose to heights of 40 feet or more, carved from single pieces of stone. The walls were decorated with elaborate carvings, reliefs of soldiers, of nobles, of the king himself in his various roles and ceremonial garments. These carvings tell stories. We can see the soldiers of different nations, the Lydians with their distinctive round shields, the Scythians with their peculiar dress, the Egyptians, the Indians. We can see them bearing tribute, weapons, vessels of precious metal, exotic animals. We can see them processing in grand formal order, approaching the king who sits elevated above them, clearly the supreme authority. Walking through Persepolis, even in its current ruined state, you have a sense of awe. The scale is immense, the craftsmanship is extraordinary, the symbolism is unmistakable. This is where power dwells. This is where the King of Kings exercises dominion over all the world. Under Darius, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. His armies pushed eastward into the Indus Valley, bringing the northwestern part of what is now India into the Persian sphere of influence. They pushed northward and westward into regions that had never before accepted Persian rule. The empire now stretched an almost unimaginable distance, from the Mediterranean Sea in the west, through North Africa and the Middle East, across the high plateaus of Persia, to the Indus River in the east. It encompassed perhaps 40 million people, speaking dozens of languages, practicing different religions, living under different local laws, but all nominally subject to the Persian crown. But Darius's ambitions went even further. He looked westward across the Mediterranean to the Greek city-states that were beginning to emerge as a significant power in their own right, and he began to plan an invasion of Greece itself. The Greek world of the 5th century BCE was very different from what we might imagine. There was no single Greece as a unified nation. Instead, there were dozens of independent city-states, most of them small, many of them in constant conflict with one another. The largest and most powerful were Athens and Sparta, two cities that were themselves rivals. These Greek city-states had developed a unique form of government, the polis, or city-state democracy. Athens, in particular, had developed a system where free male citizens participated in governing. They elected officials. They debated policy in a great assembly. They made decisions through a voting process that, while nothing like modern democracy, represented something revolutionary: the idea that power came from the people rather than from a single absolute ruler. This was alien to the Persian concept of kingship. For the Persians, the king was the center of all power. He was absolute. His word was law. The idea that ordinary people, even free people, should have a say in their governance would have seemed bizarre, perhaps even dangerous. Nevertheless, the Greek city-states were becoming increasingly powerful. They had established colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. They had developed a sophisticated culture of philosophy, art, and athletics. They were becoming an alternative center of power in the ancient world. For Darius, this was intolerable. He could not imagine a world where his will might not be supreme. And so, in the year 490 BCE, he sent a vast army westward with orders to conquer Greece. The army landed at a place called Marathon, on the coast of Attica, not far from Athens. The Persian force was enormous. Estimates vary, but they likely numbered in the tens of thousands. The Athenian force, by contrast, was much smaller, probably fewer than 10,000 men. The odds seemed impossible. But the Greeks, and particularly the Athenians, had something that the Persians did not expect: desperation and a willingness to fight for their freedom. The Athenian general Miltiades chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army on the sloping terrain of the Marathon plain, where the Persian numerical advantage would be less decisive. And then, in a moment of daring, he ordered a full charge. What happened next is one of the most famous battles in history. The Greek hoplites, armored in bronze and equipped with long spears, charged down the slope toward the Persian forces. The impact was devastating. The Persian infantry, armed with shorter spears and lighter armor, could not stand against this onslaught. They broke and fled. It was one of those moments where history pivots. The Persian army, the greatest military force the world had yet known, had been defeated by a smaller force. And worse, it had been defeated not through overwhelming force, but through tactics and courage. The myth of Persian invincibility was broken. According to Greek accounts, about 6,000 Persians died at Marathon, while the Greeks lost fewer than 200. These numbers may be exaggerated. The Greeks had a tendency to inflate their victories, but there is no doubt that the result was a stunning Greek success. When news of Marathon reached Darius, he was reportedly furious. He had been defeated, his army had been beaten, and this by a small band of Greek farmers and merchants. The wound to Persian pride was as serious as any military defeat could be. Darius was now an aging man. He had ruled for more than 30 years, but he was not finished. He immediately began preparations for a much larger invasion of Greece. However, before he could launch it, he died around 486 BCE. The throne passed to his son Xerxes, and Xerxes inherited not only the empire, but also his father's ambition to conquer Greece. The young king was determined to complete what his father had begun. He would not tolerate the humiliation of Marathon. He would lead the greatest army ever assembled, and he would bring the Greeks to heel. For 4 years, Xerxes prepared. Armies were gathered from every corner of the empire. Ships were built. Supplies were accumulated. The numbers involved were staggering. When Xerxes finally invaded Greece around 480 BCE, he brought with him something like 200,000 soldiers, and possibly many more. The Greek city-states were terrified. Some Greek cities immediately submitted and offered support to the Persians. But others, Athens and Sparta chief among them, resolved to resist. At first, they tried to stop the Persian army at a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where the terrain would limit the Persian numerical advantage. A small Greek force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, held the pass against overwhelming numbers, buying time for the other Greeks to organize their defense. According to legend, Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors died at Thermopylae, holding the pass against the entire Persian army. When the Persians asked them to surrender their weapons, Leonidas replied, "Come and take them," a response that has echoed through history as the epitome of defiant courage. The story may not be entirely accurate in its details, but the spirit of it is true. Against overwhelming odds, the Greeks refused to yield. After Thermopylae, there was nothing to stop the Persian advance. Xerxes marched to Athens and conquered the city. He burned it. He destroyed the temples on the Acropolis. For a moment, it seemed that the Persian king had finally achieved what his father had sought, the conquest of Greece. But again, the Greeks surprised him. The Athenians had evacuated their city and taken to the sea. Their navy, though smaller than the Persian fleet, was composed of ships and sailors with more experience and better tactics. In the strait called Salamis, the Greek fleet turned and fought the Persian fleet, and in that narrow body of water, the Persian naval advantage became a disadvantage. The larger Persian fleet could not maneuver. The Greek triremes, sleek, fast war galleys with experienced crews, were devastatingly effective. The Persian fleet was shattered. Xerxes, watching from the shore, realized that he could not complete his conquest of Greece without maintaining supply lines across the sea. If he lost control of the waters, his army would be trapped. He made the decision to withdraw. He left a general, Mardonius, with a substantial force to continue the fight, but he himself returned to Persia with his household and much of the army. The following year, the remaining Persian force under Mardonius was defeated in a final great battle at Plataea. The Greeks, fighting on their own soil, united in their purpose, defeated the Persians once and for all. The invasion of Greece had failed. Persian power, for the first time in generations, had encountered a force that could resist it and defeat it. The significance of this struggle cannot be overstated. At the time, it seemed quite possible that the Persian Empire would conquer Greece, just as it had conquered every other civilized region it had encountered. If that had happened, the entire course of Western civilization would have been different. Greek philosophy, Greek democracy, Greek culture, all of these things that would so profoundly influence human civilization would likely never have developed as they did. For the Persian Empire, the failure to conquer Greece was significant, but it was not fatal. The empire remained immense, immensely wealthy, and immensely powerful, but it marked a beginning of limits. There was something in the world that Persian power could not conquer. There was a boundary to Persian dominance. Xerxes, after his defeat in Greece, returned to the great palaces of Susa and Persepolis. He had inherited the greatest empire in the world. He had failed to expand it further. Now he would rule it as it was given to him. He would maintain it. He would enjoy its wealth and its splendor. But the age of expansion was ending. After the failure in Greece, the Persian Empire entered a different phase. The age of great conquests was past. The reign of Xerxes and the centuries that followed would be characterized not by territorial expansion, but by the exercise of power within established boundaries. And despite the failure in Greece, which we must remember was only one region beyond the empire's western border, the Persian Empire remained the dominant force in the ancient world. It encompassed a larger territory than any state had before. It contained more people. It commanded more wealth. From the Mediterranean to the Indus, the Persian king remained supreme. Xerxes ruled for more than 40 years after his return from Greece. He spent his time at his palaces, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana in the north, and other royal residences. The king moved seasonally, following the climate and the needs of the realm. This was a pattern established by earlier kings and maintained throughout the empire's history. The king was not fixed to one place, but moved with purpose and ceremony. What did it mean to be king of the Persian Empire at its height? It meant absolute power, certainly, but it also meant absolute responsibility. A Persian king was expected to be not merely a warrior or a politician, but a judge, a priest, a protector of the realm, a source of justice and wisdom. We know much of what daily life was like for the Persian nobility from Greek sources and from the surviving remains of the palaces themselves. The king's day began early, with audiences. Subject rulers, satraps from distant provinces, foreign ambassadors, all would come before the king to present petitions, to report on their regions, to offer tribute. The ceremonial aspects of these audiences were highly formalized. When someone approached the king, they had to prostrate themselves, literally fall to the ground and touch their forehead to the earth. This practice, which the Greeks found shocking and demeaning, was considered by the Persians to be appropriate respect for the supreme authority. The king sat on a throne, elevated above everyone else, often in a palace room of such grandeur that it overwhelmed the senses. The ceilings soared, the columns were massive, the walls were decorated with glazed tiles and painted reliefs. Everything communicated power and permanence. As the afternoon progressed, the king might retire to his private quarters or pursue various activities. He would eat, and the royal cuisine was reportedly elaborate and abundant. He had access to delicacies from across the empire, fresh fruits from Egypt, fish from the coast, game from the forests. The royal table was a microcosm of the empire itself, bringing together the best that each region had to offer. The king maintained relationships with the highest nobility, the generals, the priests, the administrators who kept the empire functioning. Some of these relationships were familial. The king had wives and concubines, and many children. Some relationships were based on loyalty and service. A general who had proven himself might become a close advisor, almost a friend, though always with the understanding that the king's authority was absolute. Despite the failure in Greece, Xerxes maintained the empire effectively. He ruled for 41 years. When he died, assassinated according to some accounts by members of his own court, the empire passed to his son, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes ruled for 43 years, longer than any other Persian king. During his reign, the empire was largely peaceful and stable. The Persian Empire of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was characterized by a kind of golden age, not an age of conquest, but an age of cultural flourishing, administrative refinement, and economic prosperity. The roads that Darius had built continued to facilitate trade. Merchants moved goods across the empire, the cities prospered, the arts flourished. We know from Greek sources that Persian culture during this period was increasingly refined and sophisticated. The Persian nobility maintained lavish estates, gardens of extraordinary beauty, libraries filled with knowledge. They wrote poetry. They sponsored artists and craftsmen. They studied philosophy and mathematics. At the same time, the Persian emperors maintained religious tolerance toward the many faiths practiced across their empire. The Zoroastrian religion, which was the faith of the Persian people themselves, was honored and supported. But the Persians did not attempt to force this faith on their subjects. Jews, Egyptians, Babylonians, all practiced their own religions and maintained their own temples. The king might make offerings to the gods of various peoples, signaling respect for their faiths. This tolerance was not based on modern concepts of religious freedom, but rather on pragmatic recognition that you could not rule a diverse empire effectively if you suppressed the beliefs of your subjects. It was also based on a certain confidence. The Persian king felt no threat from other religions. He was supreme. He could afford to be generous. The administration of the empire became increasingly sophisticated over time. The satrapy system that Darius had established was refined and improved. The postal system expanded. The standardized currency facilitated trade and taxation. A vast bureaucracy of scribes and administrators kept records, maintained order, collected taxes, and ensured that the king's will was executed throughout the realm. We know about the daily operations of the empire from many sources. Surviving administrative documents, written on papyrus or carved into stone, give us glimpses of how the system worked. We can see records of tax collection. We can see accounts of military operations. We can see correspondence between the king and his satraps. One particularly fascinating set of documents consists of the Persepolis fortification tablets, thousands of clay tablets inscribed with records about the distribution of food and drink to workers, soldiers, and officials at Persepolis. These dry administrative records, preserved by accident when the palace was burned, give us an intimate picture of daily life in the capital. We can see how many people were employed there. We can see the types of food that were distributed. We can see the organization and complexity that kept the great palace functioning. Despite its stability and wealth, there were sources of tension within the empire. The satraps, ruling their provinces with considerable autonomy, sometimes developed ambitions of their own. Some became wealthy and powerful enough that they could imagine ruling independently. Rebellions would occasionally break out, requiring military suppression. Additionally, Egypt, though conquered and incorporated into the empire, never fully accepted Persian rule. There were several major rebellions, particularly among the Egyptian priesthood and nobility. The Greeks in the western part of the empire also remained restless. The failure to conquer the Greek mainland meant that there was always a source of potential conflict on the western border. And beyond the empire's borders, there were always threats. The nomadic peoples of the steppes to the north and east were constant sources of anxiety. Occasionally, they would raid into Persian territory. The empire had to maintain a constant military presence to guard against these incursions. By the 4th century BCE, however, new challenges were emerging. The empire was very large, which made it difficult to govern. The central authority of the king, while theoretically absolute, was sometimes weak in practice, particularly when a king was weak or young. Rebellions became more frequent. The imperial institutions that Darius had created, while still functioning, were showing signs of stress. And far to the west, in the Macedonian kingdom, a rough, mountainous region that the Greeks regarded as only half-civilized, a young king named Philip was rising to power. He was an ambitious man, a brilliant military strategist, and he had ambitions that extended far beyond Macedon. His son, a boy named Alexander, would inherit these ambitions, and in a few decades, the unthinkable would happen. The Persian Empire, which had lasted for more than 2 centuries, which had conquered everything it had attempted to conquer except Greece, which had seemed eternal and unshakable, would fall, not to a rival empire from the Near East or Egypt or the Indian lands, but to a young man from a rough kingdom in the north that the Persians had scarcely considered worth mentioning. As we move into the 4th century BCE, the structure of the Persian Empire, though still magnificent and still powerful, is beginning to show serious cracks. This is not a sudden collapse. Empires the size of Persia do not fall overnight. The decline takes decades. But if you were living in those years, you would have felt a gradual erosion of central authority, a sense that things that had seemed permanent were becoming fragile. By this time, about 2 centuries had passed since Darius the Great had organized the empire into its satrapy system and built his great capitals. The individuals who had lived through those founding moments were long gone. What remained was an administrative system, however sophisticated, attempting to govern a vast territory with the communication and transportation limitations of the ancient world. The empire was too large. For all the improvements in roads and postal systems, it still took weeks or months for a message from the capital to reach the far provinces and for a response to return. In such circumstances, a satrap ruling a distant province was effectively almost independent. He collected taxes for the king, he raised armies, but he also had time and opportunity to build his own power, his own connections, his own sources of loyalty. Some of these satraps eventually decided that they did not need the king. In the 4th century BCE, there were several major rebellions by satrap rulers who attempted to establish independent kingdoms. Egypt, in particular, periodically broke away from Persian control and had to be reconquered by military force. The reconquests were expensive and destabilizing. The kings of this period, there were several after Artaxerxes I died, were not always as capable as the great founders. Some were strong rulers, but others were weak, manipulated by court factions or eunuchs who controlled access to the throne. The murder of kings or their removal from power became not uncommon. The imperial succession, which in a strong empire should be clear and undisputed, became something that had to be fought over. This kind of instability at the center inevitably spreads outward. If the people at court are uncertain who the real authority is, how can officials in distant provinces be sure either? Loyalty becomes transactional rather than genuine. People support the authority that benefits them or that seems most likely to survive, rather than supporting the empire as such. And beyond the empire's borders, forces were gathering. In Macedonia to the northwest, Philip was consolidating power and creating something new, a professional standing army, trained and equipped in novel ways, commanded by officers of exceptional skill. Philip defeated the Greek city-states in a series of battles and brought them under Macedonian control. He seemed to be creating a new empire to rival Persia. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, but his son Alexander inherited the Macedonian throne. Alexander was then 20 years old, young, ambitious, educated, and possessed of a kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had been tutored by the philosopher Aristotle. He had studied the great military campaigns of history. He had inherited his father's powerful military machine. Almost immediately, Alexander began to make plans. He would consolidate his control over Macedonia and Greece, and then he would turn his eyes eastward toward Persia. The Persian Empire, for all its wealth and extent, seemed to him vulnerable. The central authority had weakened. The satraps were not entirely loyal. The military power, though still substantial, had become less formidable than it had been generations before. The Persian king at this time was Darius III, not to be confused with Darius the Great, the founder of the empire's greatest glory. Darius III had come to power through court intrigue and was considered by ancient writers to be a decent man, but not a particularly strong ruler. He inherited an empire that was already troubled, and he would not have the ability to prevent its fall. In 334 BCE, Alexander and his army crossed from Macedonia into Asia Minor. He did not have a large force, perhaps 30,000 troops, but they were well-trained, well-equipped, and commanded by a leader of genuine military genius. The Persian satraps attempted to stop him, but they were defeated in several battles. Gradually, Alexander conquered the western provinces of the empire. The great king, Darius III, remained distant from these early conflicts. He was in the central part of the empire, at Susa or Persepolis. Perhaps he underestimated the threat. Perhaps he believed that the vast resources of the empire would eventually overwhelm this young Macedonian. Or perhaps he was simply cautious, preferring to gather his forces rather than risk direct combat until he was certain of success. But as Alexander conquered more and more territory, as the Greek general became a serious threat, Darius could no longer avoid direct engagement. In 333 BCE, the two armies finally met at a place called Issus, in what is now Turkey. Darius had assembled a very large force. The exact numbers are disputed, but easily more than 100,000 men, perhaps far more. Alexander's army was still much smaller, perhaps 30,000. But in this battle, as in others, the quality of command and the training of troops proved more important than mere numbers. Alexander attacked with such ferocity and tactical brilliance that despite their numerical superiority, the Persian forces broke and fled. Darius himself, in the forefront of the battle, realized that all was lost and retreated. He abandoned his camp, his family, and his treasury to save his own life. This was a crushing blow. Darius was the great king, the center of Persian authority. To flee before a foreign invader was unthinkable. The prestige of the Persian kingship, already damaged by internal strife, was shattered. Many Persian nobles and soldiers lost faith. Some cities, when Alexander approached, simply surrendered without fighting. Over the next several years, Alexander systematically conquered the Persian Empire. He marched across Mesopotamia, through the heart of Persian territory. He approached Babylon and took it. He marched to Susa, where the royal palace yielded its vast treasures. He moved into the Zagros Mountains and found Persepolis, the ceremonial capital that Darius the Great had built 300 years before. It was at Persepolis that the final humiliation of the Persian Empire occurred. Alexander, in a moment that combined victory celebration with deliberate destruction of a symbol of the enemy's power, ordered the burning of the palace. The great edifices that Darius and his successors had built, the columns, the walls decorated with carvings, the treasuries, all were set ablaze. Different ancient sources give different accounts of whether this was a calculated political decision or a spontaneous act of a young man drunk with victory. Some suggest that Alexander later regretted the destruction. But whatever the motivation, the burning of Persepolis became a symbol of the empire's end. The great palace, the heart of Persian power, was in ashes. Darius III himself was still alive, still in flight, still theoretically the great king, but no longer with an army or authority. As Alexander pursued him further into the eastern provinces, Darius was eventually murdered by some of his own followers, who saw no advantage in maintaining the loyalty to a king who was clearly doomed to defeat. Thus ended the Achaemenid Empire, not in a sudden catastrophe, but over a period of years. Not through internal collapse, though there were internal weaknesses, but through the military genius of a young foreign conqueror who brought together a superior military force and the tactical brilliance to use it. From Cyrus the Great in 550 BCE to the burning of Persepolis in 330 BCE, more than 2 centuries of Persian dominance came to an end in the space of a few years. An empire that had seemed eternal, that had encompassed millions of people and vast territories, was overthrown by a man not yet 30 years old. When an empire falls, what remains? This question haunts every civilization. The glory departs, the armies are defeated, the great cities may be sacked and burned, but something always persists. Ideas persist, cultural practices persist, the memory persists. In the case of the Persian Empire, much did persist, though often transformed or integrated into the conquering civilization. Alexander the Great himself, though he destroyed the palace at Persepolis, showed respect for Persian institutions and adapted many of them to his own rule. He married a Persian noblewoman. He adopted some Persian customs. He understood that you cannot rule a vast territory if you completely destroy the existing systems of governance. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals. The Persian heartland fell to Seleucus, one of Alexander's most capable commanders. Seleucus established the Seleucid Empire, which ruled much of the territory that had been Persian for several centuries. But it was not a Persian empire. It was a Greek empire, built on the foundation of Persian territorial control. The Hellenization of the Near East that followed Alexander's conquest, the spread of Greek language, Greek culture, Greek ways of thinking, was profoundly influenced by the administrative and cultural systems that the Persians had established. The Seleucid rulers adopted many Persian court customs. They maintained many of the administrative divisions that Darius had created. They continued to use the roads and postal systems that the Persians had built. The Persian language itself persisted. Though Greek became the language of the elite and of administration in the Hellenized Near East, Persian continued to be spoken by common people across the former empire. Over centuries, it would be influenced by Greek, then by Arabic, but it would persist as a living language and cultural marker. The Zoroastrian religion, the faith of the Persian people, also persisted, though it was no longer the religion of empire. It would continue to be practiced in Persia for centuries to come. Eventually, with the Arab conquest of the region and the rise of Islam, Zoroastrianism would become a minority religion. But it has survived to the present day, with communities of Zoroastrians still practicing this ancient faith. What is remarkable about Zoroastrianism is that it was, in many ways, ahead of its time philosophically. The faith taught that there was a supreme God, Ahura Mazda, who was good, and that human beings had a responsibility to choose between good and evil. It taught about the end of the world and the eventual triumph of good over evil. It taught about moral responsibility and personal judgment after death. Many scholars believe that these Zoroastrian ideas influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the 3 great monotheistic faiths that would shape the future of human civilization. Whether through direct contact or through cultural diffusion, the spiritual insights of ancient Persia rippled forward into history. The material legacy of the Persian Empire is also profound. The ruins of Persepolis, though the palace was burned, remain standing. The columns and the sculpted reliefs endured. Today, even in ruins, the site conveys a sense of the grandeur and sophistication of Persian civilization. Susa, too, survived. The palace there was not destroyed as thoroughly as Persepolis, and it continued to be inhabited and maintained as a center of power. Archaeological excavations at both Susa and Persepolis have yielded enormous amounts of information about how the Persians lived, how they organized their society, what they valued and celebrated. The very concept of empire, the idea that you could govern a vast territory containing diverse peoples under a single authority, was in many ways perfected by the Persians. Yes, there were empires before them, but the Persian system was the first to demonstrate on such a large scale how to organize diversity into a functioning whole. Later empires, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, would benefit from examining how the Persians had solved the problems of governing vast, diverse territories. The administrative innovations of Persia, the provincial system, the postal network, the standardized currency, the system of inspection and reporting, these were practical achievements that subsequent empires studied and imitated. The Persians had demonstrated that you did not need to destroy local cultures to govern them. You could allow them autonomy while maintaining overall control through administrative mechanisms and military force. The artistic legacy is also significant. The Persians, while they developed distinctive styles, were also influenced by and borrowed from the cultures of the peoples they conquered. They created a synthesis, Persian architecture incorporating Greek, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian influences. This cultural synthesis became a model for how different artistic traditions could be harmonized. In the realm of written language and literature, the Persians left a lesser mark, though not because they were uninterested in these things. Rather, they adopted the Aramaic language for administration, which was the language of the Semitic peoples they ruled. The great literary works of the Near East, the Babylonian myths, the Egyptian wisdom literature, the Jewish scriptures, continued to be preserved and copied, often in translation or adaptation. Perhaps most significantly, the Persian Empire demonstrated something about the possibility of human civilization at scale. Before Persia, empires had been large, but they had been fragile or had lasted only a short time. The Persian Empire lasted more than 2 centuries, more than 200 years of political continuity, cultural flourishing, and relative peace, that is, to the constant warfare that characterized the ancient world. This longevity and stability created the conditions for human flourishing. Art and architecture developed. Trade networks expanded. Knowledge was preserved and disseminated. Common people could live their lives knowing that there was an overarching structure of law and order that would protect them from the most extreme chaos. The fall of the Persian Empire to Alexander the Great is often seen as marking the end of the ancient Near Eastern world and the beginning of the Hellenistic world, the world of Greek dominance that would characterize the Mediterranean and Near East for the next several centuries. But we should not see this simply as an end or a defeat. The Persian Empire's greatest gift was to demonstrate that a vast, diverse civilization could be governed justly and effectively. The systems that the Persians developed, the cultural synthesis they created, the tolerance for diversity that they practiced, these lived on in the Hellenistic world and beyond. When we study the Persian Empire today, more than 2,000 years after its fall, what are we seeking? Why does it matter to us that Cyrus the Great built Pasargadae? Why should we care that Darius created the satrapy system? Why do the ruins of Persepolis still draw visitors from around the world? Part of the answer is simply that the Persian Empire is one of the great human achievements. It demonstrated that large-scale, diverse civilizations were possible. It showed that you could govern millions of people with justice and relative order. It created institutions and practices that have echoed forward through all subsequent history. But there is something else, I think. There is something in the Persian approach to power and governance that speaks to something important about human civilization. The Persians, at their best, understood that power is not merely the ability to dominate and destroy. Power is the ability to create and to build. Power is the ability to bring diverse peoples together in a common project. Cyrus the Great did not conquer the Median kingdom and then destroy it. He invited it into his system. He honored the Median nobility. He recognized that there was something valuable in the Median tradition, and that this value would be greater if it was incorporated into something larger. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he did not massacre the priesthood or forbid the worship of the Babylonian gods. He presented himself as a liberator and a protector. He promised to restore the proper worship. And the people of Babylon, recognizing that they were better off under Persian rule than they had been under their previous king, accepted his rule. This is not to say that the Persians were uniquely benevolent, or that their empire was without cruelty and injustice. Empires, by their nature, involve the domination of some people by others. But the Persian approach was distinct. They seemed to understand that the most stable empires are built not on fear alone, but on the possibility that diverse peoples can benefit from living together under a common rule. Darius the Great took this understanding even further. He created the structures and institutions that would allow such diverse peoples to live together. The postal system that connected the empire, the standardized currency, the administrative divisions, the laws and customs that provided a framework for order and justice. These were not invented by the Persians. Many of these ideas had precursors in earlier civilizations, but the Persians implemented them on a scale never before attempted. They demonstrated that such systems could actually work. In our modern world, where nation-states have boundaries and involve diverse peoples and cultures, where we face the challenge of creating governance systems that can encompass diversity, the Persian example remains relevant. The question of how to govern diversity justly and effectively is as important now as it was in the 5th century BCE. The fall of the Persian Empire to Alexander is a powerful reminder of something else, that no empire is eternal. No matter how powerful, no matter how well organized, all things eventually pass. This is not a pessimistic insight. Rather, it is a clarifying one. It reminds us that what matters is not the duration of our works, but their quality. It is not whether they endure forever, but whether they contribute something valuable to human civilization during the time they exist. The Persian Empire lasted more than 200 years. During that time, it created beauty. The palaces of Persepolis still move us with their grandeur. It created stability. Millions of people were able to live their lives with a degree of security. It created cultural synthesis. Diverse traditions were brought together and honored. And it created a model for how large, complex societies might be governed. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, he was conquering the work of centuries of human endeavor. But he was not destroying it entirely. The very fact that he could govern such a vast territory so quickly and effectively was because he was able to build on the foundations that the Persians had laid. He could use the roads they had built. He could maintain the administrative structures they had created. He could benefit from the cultural synthesis they had developed. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Persian Empire is this. It showed that when human beings work together, when they honor diversity rather than suppressing it, when they build institutions and systems that allow for order while preserving what is valuable in different cultures and traditions, remarkable things are possible. The Persians were not perfect. They were ambitious, sometimes ruthless, capable of great cruelty as well as great generosity. But they were also capable of recognizing something important, that the other peoples they encountered had value, that their traditions and beliefs had worth, that the world was larger and richer for encompassing many different ways of being human. That is the echo of the Persian Empire that comes to us across 2,000 years. Not a lesson in how to build an empire that will last forever, because no such empire exists, but a lesson in how diverse peoples can be brought together, how great things can be built, how civilization can flourish when power is exercised with something like wisdom. The palaces are in ruins, the emperors are dust, the vast armies have long since disappeared, but the example remains. In every effort to build a just society, in every attempt to govern diversity fairly, in every endeavor to create something greater than ourselves, the Persian Empire is there, in the background, showing us that such things are possible. Slowly, gently, let your awareness return to the present moment. You have traveled a great distance. You have walked through the palaces of Persepolis. You have stood in the audiences of emperors. You have witnessed the rise of an empire and its eventual fall. But you are safe. You are here, in this room, in this moment. Feel your body, heavy and warm, supported by the surface beneath you. The great kings of Persia are long gone. Their empires have passed into history. But you remain. You are present in a way that they are not. Notice the gentle rise and fall of your breath. Breathe in slowly through your nose. Hold it for just a moment. And then breathe out, releasing all the tensions of the day, all the excitement of the journey you have taken through history. The Persian Empire teaches us something important, that nothing is permanent, and that is not tragic, that all things change and transform and eventually give way to something new. The Persians built their great palaces knowing or not knowing that they would one day become ruins. But they built them anyway. They created beauty anyway. They built systems and institutions that would help their people. And because they did so, because they poured their creativity and effort into their world, they have left something that endures. You too are building. You are building your life, your understanding of the world, your relationships with others. You are creating something with your presence and your consciousness. Let that knowledge settle into you. You are part of the great human story. Sleep is coming. You can feel it approaching like a gentle tide. Let yourself sink into it. You have traveled far. You have learned much. Now you can rest. You are safe. You are home. Sleep well.